appreciate so much the opportunity to come and be with you. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's been scheduled for a little while for me to be with you. And I look forward to being with the church here again. I say again, probably none of you remember, but 42 years ago I preached here. I think the first time I ever preached in a meeting anywhere was a different speaker meeting when I was 17 years old. I spoke here. It's been 42 years. Now you know how old I am. Anyway, it's good to be back with you. I hadn't been in the building for 42 years, so I couldn't remember exactly how to get here. But nonetheless, I'm glad to be with you again. I encourage you to get a Bible and let's turn to Acts chapter 27. We'll say more at the next hour about lessons we have planned for the week and which of those would be beneficial for your friends and neighbors to come and which are more for the building up the saints. We'll talk more about that at the next hour. We start at Acts chapter 27. This is in the midst of a shipwreck where the Apostle Paul is traveling to Rome. And at this juncture, where we pick up in our reading at verse 22, it seems like, from a human standpoint, if you look at the circumstance, you would think the ship not only is going to be destroyed, but everyone's going to die. And so Paul says this. He said, I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only a ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul, for you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you and all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, brethren, for I believe God, that it shall be just as it was told me. Now you think about the circumstance where it looks like there's going to be loss of life, and an angel told me, meaning God has revealed to me, that there will be no loss of life, and Paul said, I believe God. It'll be just as he told me. Paul is talking about his trust in God. He's talking about his confidence in God. He's talking about his dependence upon God and his reliance upon God. He said, I believe God. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe God? And you say, well, sure, I believe in God. No, I didn't ask you that. I didn't ask you if you believe in God. I asked you if you believe God. Paul didn't say, I believe in God. He didn't say, I believe there is a God. He didn't say, I believe God is real. He said, I believe God. It shall be just as he told me. Let's go to another passage. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 6. The text says, but without faith it is impossible to please him, for he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's the reward of those who diligently seek him. To believe that he is to believe in God. To believe that he's the reward of those who diligently seek him is to believe God. And I'm here to tell you those are not necessarily the same. That it's altogether possible one could believe in God, believe God is and God is real, but on the other side he doesn't believe what God has said. I'm going to give you some examples of that. There's a difference in believing in God and believing God. Let's go again. Acts chapter 1 and in verse 1. Luke writes saying, the former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach. We must accept what Jesus did. That is, we must believe in him. We must believe what it says about him, that he is deity, that he worked the miracles, and that he was born of a virgin, etc. But we must also accept what Jesus taught. We must believe him. And again, those are not necessarily the same. Let's go to another passage in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. This is the conclusion to that great book called the book of John, but I would call it, to give it a subject title, of Miracles of Jesus. And here concluding that book about the miracles of Jesus, that truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. To believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, is to believe in Christ. The believing means that I believe Christ. I believe what he says. I accept what he taught. I accept every word that he's uttered. And we're going to learn a definition here in 1 John 5 and in verse 10. Let's watch for it. This passage is going to define what it means to believe God. That's our question. Do you believe God? He who believes in the Son of God has this witness in himself. He who does not believe God, there's our phrase, has made him a liar. Why would you say, if you do not believe God, why have you made God a liar? Because you have not believed the testimony that God has given of his Son. Here's what I just learned from that text. To believe God is to believe the testimony of God. It doesn't just mean I believe in God, and I believe he is and he's real, but I believe the testimony of God. Do you believe the testimony of God? So here is the challenge before us. And the challenge is, do you merely believe in God, or do you both believe in God and at the same time you believe God? You believe exactly what he said. So let's talk this morning for the rest of this period about believing God. Let's start with this. Let's talk about those who face this challenge. Let's go to the Old Testament starting, and we'll come to the New Testament as well. Some who face this challenge, and then we're going to subdivide that into two categories. Let's start with this. Let's talk about those who believe in God, and they also believed God. Notable examples to imitate. Let's just list some of those that did quite well with this challenge. Here's the first. Let's talk about Noah. In Hebrews chapter, let's start in Hebrews, and then we'll come back to the book of Genesis. Hebrews chapter 11, talking about this Old Testament character of Noah. Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 7, the text says, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not seen, moved with godly fear. Did he believe in God? Well, certainly he did, because he's functioning by faith. But did he believe God? Let's read further. He prepared an ark to the saving of his household. In other words, he did exactly what God had told him to do. Let's go back to Genesis 6 and in verse 22. In the story of the flood in Genesis chapter 6, after God gave all the requirements for the building of the ark, the dimensions and the size and the instructions for populating the ark, I want you to notice what he said in verse 22. Thus Noah did, according to all that God commanded him. Notice the next three words, so he did. What a phrase. Could that be said of you, that of all that God commanded you, so you did. So he did. So she did. That's exactly what was said concerning Noah. He not only believed in God, but when God told him there was going to be a flood, you must build an ark, he did exactly what God had told him to do. Let's take another example. Probably the most notable of Old Testament examples, and we're going to look at the New Testament commentary concerning that in Romans chapter 4. Let's talk about Abraham. Here was a man who looked at what God had told him, and from human reasoning it may seem like something unreasonable to accept, and yet he believed God exactly what God had told him. Romans chapter 4 beginning at verse 16. Therefore it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. Did Abraham have faith? Well, certainly he had faith. He believed in God. But does he believe God? Let's see. As it is written, verse 17, I have made you the father of many nations in the presence of him who believed even God. He believed God. What do you mean, Paul, that he believed even God? Who gives life to the dead and calls things that do not exist as though they did, who contrary to hope, in hope believed, so that he became the father of many nations. According to what was spoken, so shall your descendants be. And not being weak in faith, he did not consider his own body already dead, since he was about 100 years old, nor the deadness of Sarah's womb, but did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God. Now notice verse 21, and being fully convinced that what he had promised he'd also be able to perform. Here is Abraham about 100 years old, and God said, you're going to have a child. He didn't consider the fact, you know what, I'm too old for that, but he believed God and was fully convinced that what God had said would be true. He accepted the challenge, and he did quite well. Let's go even further. Let's talk about the case of Hannah. Turn with me to 1 Samuel, if you will. Chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1, and beginning at verse 1. We're not going to read, I'm going to summarize, and then we'll pick up where we need to make our point. 1 Samuel chapter 1, if you will. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, as we're introduced to Hannah, I want you to notice as we're introduced to her, she is a woman that is barren, the text is telling us. And she's praying to God, according to verse 13, that she spoke in her heart and only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. And therefore Eli thought she was drunk. And Eli said to her, how long will you be drunk? Put away your wine from among you. And she said, no, my Lord, verse 15, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but I poured out my soul before the Lord. What am I learning from that? She believes in God. She's praying to God. But what if God were to tell her something? Would she accept that? Let's see. Let's see. Therefore, do not consider your servant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaining grief I have spoken. Now Eli speaks to her, and here's what he said. Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him. In other words, God telling me to tell you, you're going to have a child. Now let's see if she believes that. Look at verse 18. She said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way, and she ate, and her face was no longer sad. What does that tell you? She accepted what she had heard. She did like Abraham. She did like Noah. She not only believed in God, but she accepted what God had told her. But now let's talk about the book of the prophet Habakkuk. Might be turning to Habakkuk chapter 1. And in Habakkuk, you remember the story of Habakkuk crying out. And what Habakkuk's complaint was is how long, he said. How long? In other words, look at the sin going on in Judah. How long, he said, are you going to let this go on, God? Does he believe in God? Well, certainly he believes in God because he's crying out to God, asking God, how long are you going to let this sin go on? So here was God's answer, verse 6. I'm raising up the Chaldeans. In other words, I'm going to raise up another nation to punish my people, Judah. He didn't think much of that. That is, Habakkuk didn't think much of that because here's what he said. I'm coming back to Habakkuk. I've jumped ahead. Let's go to the book of 2 Kings and talk about Hezekiah. Hold your finger there at Habakkuk. I'm coming back to Habakkuk. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 18 for a moment. 2 Kings chapter 18, Hezekiah was a good king. And he was an outstanding king from this vantage point. Not only did he believe in God, but I want you to notice that chapter 18, verse 5, he not only believed in God, but he trusted in God. He believed exactly what God said. He trusted in God, the God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah. Now notice verse 6, he held fast to the Lord, and did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments. In other words, he did exactly what God told him to do. He trusted in God. Now let's notice another case. Ezra. I'm quite fascinated with Ezra's statement in Ezra chapter 8. We often talk about putting our money where our mouth is. What does that mean? That means that you talk a good talk, but then sometimes when push comes to shove, you're not willing to stand up to what you said you really believe in. You kind of back and weasel away from that. Well, it comes to the case of Ezra chapter 8. Ezra had to learn to put his money where his mouth is, so to speak. Let's see what he says. Verse 22, he said, I was ashamed to request of the king an escort of soldiers and horsemen against our enemy on the road. Now, why, Ezra, were you ashamed to go to the king and say, we need some help, we need some protection, provide us with an army to protect us as we travel on the road? He said, here's why. Because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him, but his power is against those who forsake him. And his wrath is against those who forsake him. In other words, we had been telling the king, our God will bless us if we're doing what's right, and our God will be against us if we're doing what's wrong. So I had to put my money where my mouth is. In other words, I had to believe what God said. God had been telling us he'd take care of us, and I had to believe that, so we didn't go and ask for an escort. He did quite well with the challenge. Let's list one more along that line, or two more along that line. Let's talk about Joseph. Here was a case where it may be hard to accept because nothing is like this has been seen before. You remember when Joseph found out that his wife, Mary, was with child, and he knew that it was not his child. His natural inclination was to think that she's been unfaithful and she's committed a sin. So he's determined he might put her away. But in the process, An angel of the Lord appeared to him, verse 20, Matthew 1 and in verse 20, and said to him, Joseph, do not be afraid to take Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. He's never heard of anything like that before. Why should he believe that? But the angel's not through. She shall bring forth a son, and you'll call his name Jesus. He goes further to say this is the fulfillment, verse 22, of the prophet. Verse 23 he quotes from Isaiah 7. It is a prophecy concerning a virgin bearing a son. This is the fulfillment of that. Did Joseph believe that? Let's see. Let's see. Verse 24. Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife. And he did not know her until she had brought forth her firstborn son, and called his name Jesus, just like the angel had said. Here was a man who took the child, and he did quite well. Let's go even further. Let's talk about Paul. And just mention this briefly in passing because this is where we started. In the midst of the storm, when it looks like there's nothing else but to believe that everybody's going to lose their soul or their life, Paul said, I believe God. What I'm trying to picture for you is this. Here are 7 examples of those that did quite well with the challenge. They not only believed in God, but they also believed God. Now let's put that coin over and look at the other side of the coin. And here's some who believed in God, but they did not believe God. Now before I begin to list these, let me suggest to you, these are not complete apostates. Then when I mentioned the name, you said, well, of course, I would expect that of that character because they were pretenders and they ended up being complete apostates. These are not weak servants of the Lord. Then we look at it and say, well, yeah, I would expect that of them because they never were strong. And what that does is serve to us as a warning. It could happen to any one of us. Maybe I'm the one who's having trouble believing in God. We'll get some examples of that in a moment. But let's look at some Bible examples. Let's go back to the book of Exodus. Moses was a man who had trouble believing God. Did he believe in God? There is no question about that. He had trouble believing God because you remember when God told him in Exodus chapter 3, you're the man to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. Look at verse 11. Look at verse 11. He said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? In other words, I'm not the man for the job. Look at verse 13. Moses said, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and they say, who is it that has sent me? What's his name? What shall I say to them? Here's a question we hadn't thought about God. Look at another text. Look at verse chapter 4 and verse 1. And Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me nor listen to my voice. Suppose they said, Lord, I haven't appeared to you. Here's some questions, God, we hadn't thought about. This is not going to work too well. Look at chapter 4, verse 10. He said, I am not an eloquent man, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. You say I'm the servant, but I'm not the servant for you. And you say, I don't know if I'd say he doesn't believe God. Well, let's go to the book of Numbers, chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20, you remember when God told him to speak to the rock? And he smote the rock. Remember that? And because of that, he was forbidden to enter the land. And here's what God said. Because you did not believe me. I want to tell you that if a great servant like Moses has trouble believing God, I might be struggling too. That might be me. I told you these were great Bible characters. These are not weak pretenders. Moses is a man we talk about quite often as a great example we should follow. And we want to be more like Moses. And yet there was a time when he had trouble believing God. There's another example. Gideon. Turn to the book of Judges with me. And I just want to quickly notice this because I want us to get to some other points. But Gideon, you remember the judges were military deliverers. And their job was when the people would go into sin, God would send an oppressing nation. And that oppressing nation would be a trouble and a threat to the people. So God would raise up a military deliverer, a judge, who would lead them away from that and turn them back to the Lord. That was the idea of a judge. But nonetheless, Judges chapter 6. Gideon is called to deliver them from the Midianites. And much like Moses, he argues with the Lord, saying, I don't think I'm the man for the job. So notice Judges chapter 6. The Lord said to him in verse 12, you are a mighty man of valor. And Gideon said, oh my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us? He's having trouble believing God. Look at verse 14. I have sent you to save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. And he said, verse 15, how can I save Israel since my clan is the weakest in Manasseh and I'm the least of my father's house? Verse 16, you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. And he said, if I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign. He's having trouble believing God. Let's get down a little further. Look at verse 27. He finally did what God told him to do, but because he feared the father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. There's no doubt Gideon believed in God, but he had trouble believing exactly what God said. Now, I'm ready for a back. I got excited and got there a little quicker than I wanted you there. But here's the case of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk was crying out about Israel. How long are you going to let this go on? The nation and the sin is going on. God said, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. You remember that? In verse 6. His response was, he didn't think much of that, because his response was, he said, verse 13, you are pure eyes to behold evil and cannot look on wickedness. And why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours one more righteous than me? How could you do that, God? How could you raise up a more wicked nation to punish this nation that's more righteous than this wicked nation? How could you do that? He has trouble believing God. Let's go to Luke chapter 1. Let's take the case of Zechariah. This is the father of John the Baptist. And this is a classic case where we're not talking about complete apostates. We're not talking about weak servants and pretenders. Look at verse 6. Elizabeth and Zacharias were both righteous before God and blameless. I can't think of a much better compliment to be made to someone. And as Zacharias is serving as a priest before the Lord, an angel appears to him and tells him he's going to have a son. It's a prophecy of John the Baptist. And Zacharias, look at verse 18, answered and said, how shall I know this, for I'm an old man and my wife is well advanced in years? Not the same answer that Abraham gave. Just the opposite of that. How can I know this? I don't know if this could be true. You say, well, I don't know if I'd say he doesn't believe. Look at verse 20. Behold, you'll be mute and not able to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their own time. God said, even though you are a righteous man and you're blameless, this time you didn't believe what I told you. Could that be me? Could that be you? Here's a case of Peter in the New Testament. You remember what the Lord said in Matthew chapter 26? He said, all of you disciples will be made to stumble. Remember what Peter's response to that was? Not me. I'll never stumble. In other words, you're wrong, Lord. And the Lord said that you, even Peter, will deny me this very night. Remember what he said? He said, I will never deny you. I'll even die for you, but I'll never deny you. You're wrong, Lord. You're wrong. Here's what I'm learning from that. Great Bible characters like Moses and Gideon and Habakkuk and Zacharias and Peter struggled at times with accepting what God said. Maybe that could be me as well. Could that be you? Could we be having trouble believing God? Now let's talk about your challenge and my challenge. And let's start with this. Let's establish the fact that we believe in God. And so I'm going to rush through some points, not because we're in a hurry, but I just want to quickly establish something we all agree on, and then we're going to move to where the problem is, okay? Because this is not really in question, but I just want to establish that we firmly believe in God. For example, we all present, I'm sure this morning, believe that God exists. We believe He's real, like Hebrews 11. We believe that He is. There's no doubt about that. We believe He's the creator of the universe. We believe He's spoken and it was done, Psalm 33. We believe this. We believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He was declared to be the Son of God. We believe not that I am He to die in your sins. We believe this. We believe that salvation is only through the one name of Jesus Christ. We believe this. We believe that he was raised from the dead and declared to be the Son of God. We believe the Bible is God's revelation. We believe it to be inspired of God. In fact, we believe so firmly in that, we're ready to defend our faith against all challenges. If someone in this area begin to teach and begin to advocate that God does not exist, or that he did not create the world, or the Bible is not inspired, we want to have sermons on that. Brother Edwards, would you preach some sermons on the deity of Christ and the inspiration of the Scriptures? Put some articles in the paper. Let's get on the radio. Let's defend our faith. Let's disseminate material around through the community about our faith in God and the evidence of the existence of God. Let's even have a debate on that. Because we're ready to defend our faith against all challenges. We believe in God. But here's the question. Do you really believe God? Let's put that to the test. Do you believe this? Do you believe that God controls the world and the nations? The book of Daniel makes this point repeatedly. Daniel 4:25, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Do you believe that? In my mind, in the book of Revelation, chapter 4 is the pinnacle of the book, the high point of the book. And the point of it is a throne scene. And when you get through, you say, what was that all about? Well, what that's all about is saying God is still on his throne and in control. When it seems that Domitian, you take the late date, has the upper hand. It looks like he's going to destroy Christianity, and you're wondering, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Is that God is still on his throne and in control. And God rules in the kingdoms of men. I want to tell you, I'm convinced that a lot of brethren don't believe that. Evidence? You got it. I traveled among brethren, as I do every year, in a number of meetings, and in the year 2016, that don't ring a bell, that was an election year. I found brethren just in a tizzy over the election that year more than any other year that I had witnessed. And there were some brethren saying, you know what, if Hillary Clinton gets in, this world has come to an end. I don't know what we're going to do. We may have to leave this country. Somebody else saying, no, that's not the worst thing. It would be even worse if Mr. Trump gets in. And if he gets elected, hey, we're done, we're finished. I don't know what we're going to do. I want to tell you, if Miss Hillary Clinton had been elected and been inaugurated the day she became president, God would still be on his throne and he'd still be in control. Amen. And when Mr. Trump was inaugurated, you know what? God was still on his throne and in control. Amen. If another nation comes and devours and takes over Washington, and another nation is control of our nation, you know what? God will still be on his throne and in control. The question is, do you believe that? And in all the chaos going on right now in our society, do you really believe God's still on his throne and in control? A lot of things are being canceled. One thing that can't be canceled is you can't take God off his throne. Yeah. He's still there. The question is, do we believe God? Here's another thing we may have problems with, and that's he hears and he answers prayer. 1 Peter 3:12. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. Do you believe that? And you say, sure, I believe in prayer. I didn't ask if you believe in prayer. But do you really believe God hears and responds to your prayer? The question is not, do you believe God will always answer the way you wanted him to answer? That wasn't the question. The question is, do you believe that God actually hears your prayer? And he will respond to that prayer. I think quite often we, self-included, will pray earnestly about some matter. We hope this will happen. And as soon as we say amen to that prayer, we turn around and in the same breath say, that'll never happen. Do you believe God? He said he'd listen. He said he would respond. Do you really believe God? What about this? Do you believe that children ought to obey and respect their parents, particularly teenagers, young folks? Pay attention to this. You see, Ephesians chapter 6, children obey your parents in the Lord. That's a command of God. Children ought to obey their parents, to respect their parents. Same principle in Colossians 3 and in verse 20. Quite often in school when we get into a discussion about evolution, or whether or not the Bible is real or is the Bible complete, some young person will come for help from the preacher, from one of the elders, or from their parents, and they want to rush back to defend their faith because we believe in God. That's great. But then those people that you're trying to defend your faith against see you deliberately disobeying your parents. What you just demonstrated is, I believe he exists, but I don't believe what he said. I don't believe what he said. Well, I don't accept what he's saying. I just think he's real. Do you believe God? Do you believe that how you raise your child is how the child will turn out? Proverbs 22:6. Train the child in the way that you go when he's old enough to depart from it. Do you remember that passage? That's a proverb, by the way, which means it's a general statement to which there may be exceptions. I understand that. And so do you. And I'm convinced there's some brethren who don't believe that principle. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, I think I know some brethren who think that they have one child turn out to the world, the next child turns out to the world, their third child turns out to the world, but it can't have anything to do with the way I'm raising the children. Society's fault. It has nothing to do with me. The general principle is the way you train a child is how the child's going to turn out. It has everything to do with that. Do you believe God? Do you believe this? Do you believe church discipline works? Church discipline works. Here's a case at Corinth where they were not exercising discipline. Paul wrote to them in 1 Corinthians 5 and told them they needed to exercise discipline, to withdraw from him. That included not socializing with him. That is, don't keep company with him. That means to mix up together with. You don't mix up together with him. You don't socialize with them. So that you could bring him to repentance. I think I know some brethren who think that doesn't work. I know a number of churches that don't practice discipline at all. And others, though they may practice it, will have an element within the church that begins to argue. I don't think this does any good. I think it drives more people away than it brings them back. And I think that's not showing love because we're being ugly to them and we're pushing them away. And I just don't think church discipline works. And I've been asked on more than one occasion, can you cite one case where discipline ever worked and brought them back? Yes, I can. Corinth. 2 Corinthians 2, he came back, didn't he? Well, besides that, I don't need another one. That one worked. That one worked. But yes, I can cite more. In churches I've worked with, and so can you. Do you believe God? That this is the way to go? Maybe when it's in your family, and the church is about to withdraw, do you try to pull that back, or do you say, I think that's what y'all need to do because I want my child to be treated like God wants them to be treated? Sometimes we have trouble believing God. Do you believe this? Do you believe that you'll not be allowed to be tempted greater than you can bear? 1 Corinthians 10 and in verse 13 says, God will not allow you to be tempted greater than that which you can bear, but he will provide a way to escape. This temptation is common, bearable to man. Do you ever get to the point you say, this is more, I can't handle this. This is a temptation, this is a burden, this is a pressure that I can't bear. I can't take this. And yet God said he's not going to allow you to be tempted greater than you can bear. You believe God? You believe it? Or are you going to say, you know what, I think I can handle this. I think I can. Because God said it. Here's another passage we need to understand clearly in its context. Philippians chapter 4 and in verse 13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That verse has been misquoted so many times. Or maybe misapplied than misquoted. It's quoted correctly, but it's just misapplied. In the sense that some are applying it in the sense of an all positive mental attitude. And so you go to a sales meeting and they're trying to pump you up like a cheerleader, telling you you can sell more and you can be the best salesman this company ever had because you can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the same thing is true in athletics. You want to be the best ball player, I can do all things through Christ. Have that positive attitude. That's not what this text is talking about. It is saying I can bear any trial, I can obey any command, I can do anything God expects of me. Do you ever look at a command and say, you know what, I know I can be pretty good at other things, but this one, I just can't bring myself to do. I can't do that. That's too hard for me. I can't do it. I've had Christians tell me that. That's what God's expecting me. I cannot do that. That's too hard. I cannot do that. That's beyond my capability. I cannot do that. So I just can't do that command. Do you believe what God said? He said you can obey any command. And if I find in the scriptures it says to do that, then I can do it. I have the capability. Do you believe this, that the power is in the gospel? I believe the power is in the word. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Everyone believes, the Jews first and also the Greek. Or I believe the power is in the man. If we could just, man, if we could just have a crowd and have a dynamic speaker, man, what good could be done? Is it in his personality? Is it in his speaking ability? Or isn't the message in the power of the word? Where's the message? Where's the power? Do you really believe in the power of the word, the gospel? Do you believe this? Do you believe association with evil corrupts? 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil communications corrupts good manners. Or do you think, you know what, I can associate with those that are practicing evil? Or as per the context, those who are teaching error? I can socialize with them. I can associate with them. That doesn't affect me. See, I'm strong. It doesn't bother me. And yet God said it does. Do you believe God? Do you believe this? Do you believe Christ could return at any time? We preach and teach about the second coming. He'll come as a thief in the night. Do you believe that's real? When Jesus returns, it's going to be in somebody's lifetime, isn't it? That could be mine, could be yours. It might not come until hundreds or thousands of years from now. I don't know. But do you believe it's a real possibility that not only you could die, but that Christ could return in your lifetime? That's a possibility. So I need to be ready. Do you really believe it? I want to close with this question, and that is, do you believe enough to obey God? You see, it's one thing to believe in God. It's another thing to believe God, and it's even another matter to act upon that faith. And I say Moses. Well, Moses believed in God. He even believed that water would come from the rock, didn't he? He'd seen it before. So when God said water's going to come from the rock, he believed God, all right. But he didn't believe enough to act upon that faith and do exactly what God told him to do. Do you believe God? One last example, and the lesson will be yours. Jeremiah had been preaching for years and years that Israel would return after 70 years. They will come back from captivity. He believed that. And you say evidence? What evidence would you cite? He bought a field, Jeremiah 32 is a promise. In other words, he put his money where his mouth is. I say we're coming back. I believe we're coming back. Let me show you I believe we're coming back. I'm going to buy this field. If you're not coming back, I'm going to buy the field. Our question this morning is, do you believe God? We've looked at those who faced the challenge and did quite well, those who faced the challenge and didn't do well. The question is, how well are you doing in the challenge? Do you believe God? Thank you for your attention.